The child was born screaming, but it wasn't a normal scream. It was a rasping, unnatural cry that startled even the midwives. His limbs were twisted, his skull bulged oddly, and his skin bore a pallor that made the candlelight flicker as though recoiling in fear. To the royal court, it was an ill omen. To the mother, it was something worse, a mirror. For in that child's body was written the sin of generations, a grotesque ledger of bloodlines folded back on themselves again and again until nature finally screamed, "Enough." This is the story of Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, and the son she bore into a world already weighed down by dynastic ambition and superstition. A child who would grow to be Emperor Charles V, most powerful man in Europe, but who carried within him the physical and psychological burden of centuries of royal inbreeding. His birth marked not a triumph, but a terrible warning. For while he would wield unimaginable power, he would also suffer beneath the weight of a crown built on broken genes. Spain, 1500. A kingdom newly forged from conquest and Catholic fervor, rising on the ashes of Moorish Granada, and united under the iron will of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The Catholic monarchs, they were called pious, ruthless, visionary, and like all dynasties, their ambitions were rooted not just in faith or war, but in blood. Bloodlines were everything. Marriages were weapons, wombs were battlegrounds, and children were the stakes. Into this cauldron stepped their daughter, Joanna. She was not meant to be queen. As the third child, her destiny was diplomacy. She was married off to Philip the Handsome of the Habsburg dynasty in 1496 to secure a powerful alliance. It was a marriage that would fuse Spain with Austria and Burgundy, laying the foundation for a global empire. But it was also the moment when two of Europe's most dangerously inbred houses collided and passed that curse to their descendants. Joanna, intelligent and melancholic, found herself helplessly in love with Philip, a man as cold and ambitious as she was passionate and devoted. Their union produced 6 children, each a new branch on a sickly, twisted family tree. The most fateful of these was Charles, born in 1500 in the Flemish city of Ghent. He was born into grandeur, baptized in gold, destined to rule an empire on which the sun would never set. But even from the beginning, there were signs. His jaw was already unusually pronounced, his lower lip overly full. Nurses noted his slow motor development, but such defects were dismissed hidden beneath silk and heraldry. The truth was far more chilling. For centuries, both the Spanish Trastamaras and the Austrian Habsburgs had intermarried with a zeal that bordered on madness. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. It was not out of love, but a calculated obsession with purity of blood. The idea was simple. Keep the power in the family, but nature is not so easily controlled. The cost of this genetic hoarding was hemophilia, infertility, deformities, and madness stalked their lineages like ghosts. Joanna herself may have been a victim. Her mother, Queen Isabella, was ferocious and devout, but emotionally distant. Her father, King Ferdinand, was cunning, manipulative, and prone to controlling his children's fates with iron precision. Joanna, caught between the two, began to unravel under the weight of expectation. After Philip's death in 1506, her grief tipped into hysteria. She clung to his corpse, refused burial for months, and descended into a paranoia that her husband had been poisoned and would rise again. She was declared insane. Whether it was political convenience or genuine illness remains debated. But one thing is certain, she was locked away for the rest of her life, sequestered in a lonely convent in Tordesillas, while her son Charles was groomed for power. But Charles was no ordinary heir. From the start, he was raised not just as a king, but as the culmination of centuries of dynastic ambition. By the time he was 19, he had inherited the crowns of Spain, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire. The world bent to his will, and yet beneath the weight of all this power, his body and mind bore the scars of inbreeding too severe to ignore. His famous Habsburg Josso pronounced it interfered with speech, and chewing was just the beginning. His mouth hung perpetually slack, his tongue thick, his voice slurred. Paintings tried to flatter, but even they could not hide the unnatural proportions of his face. Doctors whispered of other abnormalities: a hunched spine, nervous tremors, digestive disorders, and sudden rages that suggested neurological imbalance. But none dared speak of the true source, because to do so was to indict the very system that crowned him. By the time Charles ascended to full imperial power, he was already a man isolated by his own bloodline. The very thing that made him supreme also made him a warning one that would only become more grotesque with each generation that followed. For Charles would pass his legacy down to his son, Philip II, and then to Philip's descendants. The Habsburg line would not die in war or assassination. It would die in bed, strangled by its own incestuous grasp. But that is for later. For now, Charles stands on the cusp of glory, unaware that he is both emperor and experiment. Born of a queen condemned for madness, shaped by generations of deliberate genetic narrowing, and bearing the face of a dynasty too proud to admit defeat. The monster wasn't in the dungeon. It wore a crown. Charles V did not rise to the throne like a comet. He arrived like a tidal wave, slow, massive, and unstoppable. Inheriting a patchwork of kingdoms from his grandparents and his father, he became, in effect, the ruler of half the known world. Spain, the Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Italy, and vast new colonies in the Americaceous dominion was so sprawling that it was said the sun never set on his empire. But behind the gold and pageantry, a darker truth lingered. His body was crumbling even as his power peaked, and his court was already whispering about the strange volatility of the emperor. As a young ruler, Charles was determined to prove himself worthy. He worked tirelessly, speaking multiple languages with fluency: Latin, French, Spanish, and some German, though his heavy jaw made pronunciation a labor. Every public appearance was rehearsed to hide his physical imperfections. His Habsburg features were prominent, a mandible so large it pushed out his lower lip, leaving his mouth half open even at rest. His drooping eyelids gave him the appearance of perpetual exhaustion, but his ambition burned brightly, almost feverishly, as if he were racing time or fate. The Spanish nobility viewed him with suspicion. He was born in Ghent, spoke Castilian with a heavy Flemish accent, and had surrounded himself with foreign advisors. His own mother, Joanna, was still alive but locked away, officially declared unfit to rule. Yet she was the rightful Queen of Castile, and some factions whispered that Charles ruled only by convenience, not by divine right. To silence dissent, he staged a formal co-rule with Joanna, making decrees in both their names. Though she remained locked in a darkened room, her meals passed through a slit in the door. He was haunted by her. Despite her physical absence, Joanna's presence loomed large in Charles's life. He never saw her again after childhood, yet he kept a tight grip on her imprisonment, occasionally sending emissaries to ensure she was still quiet. Reports from Tordesillas were troubling. She refused to bathe, whispered to invisible figures, and raged at the night sky. But there were also accounts of lucidity, of moments when she spoke with clarity about the political situation in Spain, or asked about her children with startling precision. These glimpses left lingering doubts. Had she truly gone mad, or had the crown simply found her too inconvenient to keep free? Madness, it seemed, was as much political as it was genetic. As Charles matured, so too did the empire, but not without conflict. The Reformation exploded across Europe in 1517, just as Charles took full control of the Holy Roman Empire. Martin Luther's 95 Theses were a direct affront to the Catholic unity Charles was sworn to uphold. But even as Protestantism spread like wildfire, Charles found himself paralyzed. His jaw made long speeches painful. His growing list of ailments made travel torturous. He attempted to crush the movement with military force, leading campaigns in the German states. But his successes were always temporary. The tide was turning. At home, things were not much better. Spain was a divided kingdom, Castile in the center, Aragon in the east, and the newly conquered Granada in the south. Charles raised taxes to fund his endless wars, prompting revolts from the common people and nobility alike. The revolt of the Comuneros in 1520 nearly toppled his rule in Castile. Protesters didn't just demand lower taxes, they questioned the legitimacy of a foreign-born emperor who had never truly been Spanish in heart or blood. Charles responded with brutal efficiency. Leaders were executed, lands confiscated, and resistance crushed. But the wounds remained. Beneath his regality, Charles was deteriorating. His body, though relatively young, behaved like that of an old man. He suffered chronic gout so severe that he often had to be carried in a litter or wheeled in a chair. The swelling in his joints caused his fingers to twist painfully, making writing and swordplay nearly impossible. His digestion was irregular, and his appetite, once voracious, became unpredictable. His physical state was mirrored by psychological instability, long bouts of melancholy, violent outbursts, and obsessive religious guilt. And then came Isabella. In 1526, Charles married Isabella of Portugal's first cousin. Their union was yet another chapter in the Habsburg policy of intrafamily breeding. Unlike most political marriages, this one was said to be genuinely affectionate. Isabella was intelligent, devout, and tolerant of Charles's strange habits. She bore him multiple children, but only one son, Philip, would survive to adulthood. From the moment Philip was born, the signs were there. A rigid jaw even more pronounced than his father's eyes that seemed oddly recessed, a reserved, anxious temperament, but worst of all, a frailty that suggested something deeper. Doctors noted that Philip had inherited not only the Habsburg chin, but also their internal corrosion, weak bones, sluggish movement, and a terrifying precocity for paranoia and rigidity. He would grow up to be even more devout than Charles, more reclusive, more inflexible, and even more determined to keep the royal bloodline pure at any cost. Charles saw in Philip both salvation and doom. He poured all his hopes into the boy, grooming him to be a monarch who would finish what he had started: the crushing of Protestantism, the securing of Catholic dominance, and the preservation of Habsburg supremacy. But the closer Charles looked at his son, the more he began to suspect what others dared not say aloud: that the monster he feared was not yet born. It was being bred. By the 1540s, the once unstoppable Emperor Charles V had become a walking contradiction. Supreme ruler of Europe's greatest empire and prisoner of his own deteriorating body, he was still feared, still revered, but now cloaked in the scent of incense and ointments, shuffling between wars and monasteries, limping under the weight of robes that once hung regally from his shoulders. And always she was haunted by his lineage, not just the legacy of greatness he had inherited, but the whispering consequences of what that greatness had cost. The truth was manifesting all around him. Philip, now a teenager, had grown into the perfect image of the Habsburg ideal in paper. He was pious, serious, and thoroughly indoctrinated into the ideology of divine kingship. Tutors described him as intelligent, but disturbingly inflexible. He showed no signs of joy or spontaneity, and his demeanor was described as mechanical, even in childhood. When asked about his interests, he would mutter vague phrases about duty and faith. His companions were few. His pleasures were fewer. He moved stiffly, rarely smiled, and spoke with a heavy lisp, another gift of the Habsburg jaw, now even more exaggerated in him. But Charles clung to him as his legacy. He began gradually transferring responsibilities to Philip. First, the governorship of Spain, then the administration of Naples and the Netherlands. In public, Charles praised his son. In private, he worried. There were moments when Philip seemed too cold, too withdrawn, too removed from the common pulse of men. Yet Charles, ever the creature of royal doctrine, would not admit the flaw. Instead, he doubled down, arranging a marriage for Philip that mirrored the same dark strategy that had governed his own birth: blood with blood. In 1543, at the age of 16, Philip was married to his first cousin, Maria of Portugal. Maria, herself a product of inbreeding, was delicate and melancholy traits that seemed to echo across every generation of Europe's royal houses. The match, like so many before it, was designed to strengthen dynastic bonds, not emotional ones. It succeeded in breeding an heir, but barely. Maria died within 4 days of giving birth. The child she delivered, a boy named Don Carlos, would become the very embodiment of everything that had gone wrong. But Charles, still focused on empire, barely had time to mourn. Wars with France dragged on endlessly. The Ottomans threatened the Mediterranean. Protestantism continued to flourish in the German states, despite Charles's repeated military efforts to stamp it out. At the Battle of Mühlberg, in 1547, Charles achieved a fleeting victory over the Protestant princes. He declared it divine vindication, but privately. the triumph rang hollow. His gout had left him immobile during the battle, and he received news of his enemy's defeat from a chair, his feet swaddled in bandages soaked in wine and herbs. The empire was beginning to rot from within, and Charles could feel it. In 1555, after nearly 4 decades of rule, he stunned Europe by announcing his abdication. No emperor in living memory had done such a thing voluntarily, but Charles was done. Done with war, done with politics, done with the pain. He divided his Holdingshire brother Ferdinand would take the Holy Roman Empire, and Philip would inherit Spain, the Netherlands, and the vast New World territories. It was a clean break, but it left behind a poisoned throne. Charles retreated to the remote monastery of Yuste in western Spain, where he lived in eerie silence, surrounded by relics and skulls, monks and doctors. He spent his final years in religious contemplation, endlessly confessing, flagellating, and reflecting. He read the book of Job. He obsessed over prophecies. He ordered portraits of himself to be painted alongside Christ on the cross. His body was decaying rapidly, his teeth blackened, his eyes clouded, and his bowels chronically inflamed. But it was his mind that bore the worst scars. He began to fixate on Don Carlos, his grandson, the child born of his son and niece. The boy was a disaster. From infancy, Don Carlos showed signs of profound physical and mental instability. His head was abnormally large. He suffered seizures. His body was frail but strangely misshapen, and he limped when he walked. His behavior, even as a child, veered between manic bursts of energy and deep catatonic silence. He was violent, irrational, and cruel, torturing animals, attacking servants, and erupting into incoherent rages that terrified even hardened courtiers. And yet, by blood, he was next in line to inherit the greatest empire on earth. Charles saw in Don Carlos not just a malformed child, but a mirror of his own choices, a living punishment for generations of arrogance. The strategy that had elevated his family to supreme power was now devouring it from within. The queen who had given birth to the monster, he realized, was not just Joanna. It was all of them. Every king and queen who had chosen cousin over commoner, dynasty over humanity, purity over survival. Charles had been their apotheosis, and now Don Carlos was the reckoning. In the final year of his life, Charles requested something peculiar. He ordered a mock funeral to be held for himself while he was still alive. Surrounded by monks and the sound of dirges, he lay in a coffin as priests read his last rites. He wept silently, gripping a crucifix, while incense curled like smoke from a burning empire. It was not a performance. It was a confession. And in 1558, shortly thereafter, he died. Charles V, the most powerful man in the world, succumbed not on a battlefield or in a palace, but in a dark monastery cell, crippled by the very legacy he had spent a lifetime building. The crown passed to Philip II, but the monster Charles had foreseen his own grandson was growing, watching, waiting. The empire had not been destroyed by its enemies. It had been poisoned by its own blood. Don Carlos of Spain was not a man. He was a storm inside, a body violent, howling, and broken. From the moment he was born in 1545, he was a living omen. His birth was a difficult one. The delivery tore through his mother's fragile body and left her bleeding for days. She died shortly after, and Don Carlos came into the world surrounded by mourning. The court tried to find comfort in tradition. The infant was swaddled in silk, baptized with gold and incense, and proclaimed a future king. But those who saw him in his cradle could not ignore the truth. There was something wrong. He didn't cry like a normal baby. He screamed, and he didn't stop. His head was misshapen and enormous, and his spine curved unnaturally. His limbs seemed limp one day, rigid the next. Some days he would fall into long, vacant stares. Other times he would claw and bite his nurses. One doctor suggested trepanation. Another claimed the child had been cursed. But most at court knew better. They had seen this before in whispers in back corridors, in the shadows of royal portraits with jaws too long and eyes too empty. Don Carlos was the product of everything the Habsburgs had refused to acknowledge, that their obsession with blood purity had finally produced a genuine monster, not in the poetic sense but in the biological one. He was inbred to the point of collapse. His pedigree was dazzling on paper, grandson of Charles V, son of Philip II, heir to a global empire. But his body and mind bore the weight of 200 years of cousins marrying cousins. As he grew, so did the signs. He had trouble walking. He fell frequently, and by adolescence, one leg had become shorter than the other. He walked with a lurching gait, dragging his foot behind him. His Habsburg jaw was even more grotesque than his father's or grandfather's. He couldn't chew properly. His speech was slurred. He was nearsighted and often squinted, giving him a menacing, vacant glare. His tutors described him as incapable of sustained learning, quick to anger, unable to concentrate, and prone to terrifying outbursts. At 13, he beat a stable boy unconscious for looking at him. At 15, he tried to push a servant down the stairs, laughing hysterically as the man tumbled. At 16, he attempted to seduce his own aunt. But still, he was a prince. Philip II, cold and devout, refused to publicly acknowledge his son's issues. He surrounded Carlos with advisors and priests, each ordered to guide him toward sainthood and stability. But nothing worked. Carlos raged against discipline. He grew suspicious of everyone, convinced that he was being spied, uneven poisoned. He refused to bathe for weeks. He refused to sleep indoors. He demanded fresh meat every day, even when the court observed fasting. He tore apart his own bed linens in the night. He howled verses of scripture backwards, then smashed crucifixes. There was no treatment for his condition because no one dared name it. In the 1560s, rumors began to swirl. Foreign ambassadors reported to their courts that the heir to Spain was unsound of mind and twisted of body. Some speculated that Philip II would pass him over in the line of succession. But Philip, ever the embodiment of royal duty, refused. He would not shame his bloodline. He would not break centuries of royal precedent. Carlos was his only legitimate son. He would be king. And so, the monster was kept in the palace, barely restrained, but officially revered. But Spain was changing. The Inquisition loomed over every town and city. Protestant heresies were being hunted with fire and steel. Revolts flared in the Netherlands, and the Spanish treasury, bled dry by war, teetered toward collapse. Philip became more reclusive, more obsessed with the divine justification of his rule. He believed himself chosen an instrument of God, but even instruments can crack, and the crack was Carlos. In 1562, everything unraveled. Don Carlos, by then 17, fell down a flight of stairs. He landed on his head. The wound was ghastly, his skull split, blood pouring from his ears. For days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Priests read last rites. Philip was advised to prepare for his son's death, but Carlos survived. And when he awoke, he was different. Worse. Now more unstable than ever, he became dangerously violent. He tried to stab a guard who denied him dessert. He smeared feces on the walls of his chambers. He threatened to kill his father. Some say he kept a list of people he wanted executed when he became king. He began stockpiling weapons under his bedaggers, razors. Knivesand told his attendants that he was planning to flee to the Netherlands and wage war against his own father. Philip was paralyzed. To execute his son would be political suicide. To crown him would be madness. And so, the king made the most chilling decision of his reign. In January 1568, Philip II had his son arrested. Don Carlos was dragged from his chambers by guards and locked in a specially fortified room in the Alcazar of Madrid. The windows were sealed. The door was triple locked. Only a handful of servants were allowed contact. All knives, forks, and mirrors were removed. He was kept under constant surveillance. The official statement was vague, for reasons of state. But everyone knew. Spain's crown prince had been declared unfit. He spent 6 months in confinement. He starved himself, then gorged. He tore his clothes, then begged for new ones. He spoke to ghosts. He slammed his head against the stone walls. He wrote mad letters to foreign kings, claiming he was being tortured by demons. His weight dropped rapidly. His skin turned gray. Some say he tried to claw his own eyes out. Others say he simply wasted away, consumed by the darkness inside him. On July 24, 1568, Don Carlos died. The cause of death was never revealed. Some said fever. Some said infection. Some whispered poison. Philip II announced his passing without ceremony, without funeral procession, without public grief. The boy was erased. But the world remembered, and the story spread of a prince born twisted, raised in terror, and buried in silence. A prince not failed by fate, but built by generations of kings who thought themselves gods. Don Carlos was not a fluke. He was the harvest. After Don Carlos died, Spain exhaled, but not with relief. It was the breath one takes after witnessing a tragedy too large to comprehend. Behind the palace walls, the most powerful man in Europe had buried his only son. No funeral bells rang. No eulogies were spoken. No tomb was built for mourning. Philip II did not weep in public, nor did he mention Carlos's name again. The court closed ranks. The servants were silenced. The documents were sealed. The people of Spain were left to whisper. But in the rest of Europe, the silence only amplified the horror. Foreign courts devoured the tale like wolves, each retelling more grotesque than the last. The French accused Philip of having murdered his own son. The Dutch, already at war with Spain, declared Carlos a martyr. Plays were written. Poems were sung. One of the most famous, Friedrich Schiller's Don Carlos, would later be adapted by Verdi into an opera that depicted Carlos as a doomed romantic hero, imprisoned by a tyrant father. But reality was crueler than fiction. The truth, buried in layers of fear and protocol, was that Carlos had died the way he had lived, in pain, in isolation, and in the dark. Philip, however, was not done. His obsession with blood, order, and God only deepened. The Habsburg dream still burned in his chest, and he would not let it die with his son. He had daughters, yes, but they were pawns. He needed a male heir, and he would get one. In 1570, just 2 years after Carlos's death, Philip married again. His bride was Anne of Austria, his niece. The marriage was grotesque, even by Habsburg standards. Anne was the daughter of Philip's own sister, Maria. That made her not only his niece, but also a double Habsburg, descended from both the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family. She was 17. He was 43. The match was political, but also desperate, a last attempt to preserve a dynasty teetering on the edge of genetic collapse. Anne bore of Philip 5 children. 4 died young. The 5th, born in 1578, was named Philip. Another attempt to create a legacy, another thread in the fraying rope of the Habsburg bloodline. The boy would eventually become Philip III of Spain. He survived, but he was weak both in body and will. Pale, passive, and obedient, he ruled through favorites and left the true power of the empire in the hands of others. He was not a monster like Don Carlos. He was worse. He was empty. The rot that had begun in Charles V and flowered grotesquely in Don Carlos had now settled into inertia, spiritual and political paralysis. The great empire, forged by war, held together by faith, and guarded by generations of royal inbreeding, was beginning to decay in silence. The colonies still flowed with silver. The Inquisition still burned. But the heart of the empire was hollow, and the world could smell the weakness. Across the sea, England was rising. Elizabeth I had defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, crippling Spain's naval supremacy. The Dutch had broken free after decades of rebellion, forming the Dutch Republic and becoming a thorn in Madrid's side. In France, the Valois line had collapsed and been replaced by the House of Bourbon, a new dynasty, unburdened by the genetic curses of the Habsburgs, nimble and hungry. Meanwhile, Philip II aged into stone. He became reclusive, consumed by religious ritual and suspicion. He wore black constantly. He slept on a wooden board. He filled his palace with relics, skulls, and crucifixes. He dictated edicts from a dark chamber in the massive Escorial monastery palace, which he himself had built part tomb, part fortress, part reliquary for his soul. He had portraits of his dead son Carlos removed or hidden. He never spoke his name. It was as if Carlos had been a fever dream, best forgotten. But history does not forget, and neither does blood. Because while Philip II died in 1598, believing he had secured the Habsburg legacy through his grandson Philip III, the genetic damage was already irreversible. Philip III would reign quietly, passing the empire to his son Philip IV, and Philip IV would pass it to his son Charles II. and Charles II was the final echo, the last toll of a bell that had been ringing since the union of Joanna and Philip the Handsome. Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, would come into the world disfigured, barely functional, and so riddled with defects that modern scientists analyzing his family tree found his inbreeding coefficient to be higher than if he were the product of incest between siblings. He could barely speak. He could barely chew. He could not father children. His face was a caricature of the Habsburg jaw. His mind, foggy and confused. He was the end. The final heir of a line that had believed itself divine and unbreakable. But the story of Charles II is more than an ending. It is the culmination of centuries of hubris, a lesson written not in ink but in flesh. The queens who gave birth to monsters were not wicked women. They were prisoners of a system that demanded purity at the expense of humanity. Joanna, called mad. Maria, who died birthing Carlos. Anne, who married her own uncle. Each played their part. Each bore children into a world where their blood was more important than their health, their minds, or even their lives. And the result? An empire collapsing under the weight of its own perfection. A dynasty unraveling from the inside. And a final king who would live a life so haunted, so grotesque, and so tragic, that his very existence would become the proof that divine blood could, in fact, curse more than it blessed. But Charles II deserves his own reckoning. And that reckoning is next. Charles II of Spain was never meant to live, not by nature, not by medicine, not even by the desperate hopes of his own family. When he was born on the 6th of November, 1661, the midwives reportedly paused. There was no cry at first. His skin was pale blue, his head too large, his limbs limp. Some believed he was stillborn. Others whispered he should have been. But he lived. And with his survival, the centuries-long curse of royal inbreeding reached its dreadful climax. Charles II was the great-great-grandson of Joanna of Castile and Philip the Handsome through both his mother and father. His Habsburg lineage was so entangled that his own family tree folded back on itself multiple times. Scientists studying his genetic profile centuries later estimated that over 80% of his DNA came from the same narrow family bloodline. In modern terms, he was more genetically inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. He was not born a child. He was born a relic. From infancy, his body failed him. He had rickets, constant diarrhea, seizures, and barely any muscle tone. He could not walk until the age of 8. He did not speak coherently until nearly 10. He drooled constantly. His tongue was so oversized that he could not chew or close his mouth properly. The infamous Habsburg jaw, already exaggerated in Philip II and Don Carlos, was now so grotesquely developed in Charles that it deformed his entire face. His skull bulged. His teeth barely met. He was nearly blind in one eye. And yet, he was crowned king. At 3 years old, following the death of his father Philip IV, Charles II was declared monarch of the Spanish Empire. A child already on the brink of collapse, handed the greatest empire on earth. His mother, Mariana of Austria, his father's niece, and his own enthroned as regent. And so the dynasty continued. One more queen forced to give birth to a monster, and one more monster forced to wear a crown. The court tried to hide the truth. Official portraits of Charles II were softened, romanticized. His twisted jaw was painted with artistic kindness. His pale skin was shaded with false vitality. But the people saw the truth at royal audiences, at feast days, in the trembling, awkward movements of a boy who could not walk properly or speak in full sentences. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in horror. One wrote, "He is ugly beyond all imagination. He looks ill. He cannot speak. He cannot hold his head straight. I pity Spain." And Spain was indeed crumbling. Under Charles, the once mighty empire spiraled into ruin. The royal treasury was empty. The Spanish Armada was a ghost of its former self. The silver mines of the Americas were depleted, and rebellion simmered in every corner of the realm. Plague, famine, and economic collapse ravaged the cities. The court was paralyzed, consumed by internal intrigue, with Mariana clinging to power through her personal confessor, Father Nithard, a Jesuit whose influence overshadowed ministers and generals alike. Charles, meanwhile, aged without truly growing. As a teenager, he had the mind of a child. As an adult, he was weak, incoherent, and often bedridden. He developed hydrocephalus fluid buildup in the brain, which worsened his seizures and left him in constant pain. He suffered hallucinations. He was impotent. His entire reign was marked by one long question: can the king beget an heir? The answer was no. Charles was married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess, and then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German noblewoman. Both marriages were political attempts to produce an heir and secure the crumbling Habsburg legacy. Neither succeeded. Marie-Louise, vivacious and beautiful, withered into depression and died young. Rumors swirled that she was poisoned. Maria Anna, more politically astute, clung to power but failed to produce a child. Charles blamed witchcraft. His advisors blamed the queen. But everyone knew the truth. The monster's body was too broken to create life. By the 1690s, Charles was a walking corpse. He suffered constant fevers, digestive failure, kidney infections, and blackouts. He could not walk without assistance. His speech had declined into slurred babble. His hair fell out. His skin hung from his bones. He saw demons. He begged priests to perform exorcisms. At one point, he ordered the exhumation of his ancestors' bodies, believing that their corpses were cursing him from beyond the grave. The court, once a glittering seat of power, had become a grotesque theater of superstition and decay, and through it all, Charles II reigned empty-eyed, drooling, and dying. His face, contorted by the sins of his bloodline, was a living warning. His body, so twisted it could barely function, was the final consequence of a dynasty that had confused divinity with incest. He died on the 1st of November, 1700, at the age of 38. He had no heir, no strength, no legacy. In his will, he left the Spanish crown to Philip of Anjou-Bourbon, grandson of Louis XIV of France. The Habsburgs had finally broken themselves, and Europe plunged into war over the corpse of a king who should never have been born. The War of the Spanish Succession would last over a decade, killing hundreds of thousands. The once mighty Spanish Empire would never recover its former glory. The Habsburgs would survive in Austria for another century, but the Spanish branch had reached its end, extinguished not by enemies, but by its own refusal to let new blood in. The story of the queen who gave birth to a monster is not just about Joanna of Castile. It's about every queen who was forced to marry her cousin, every princess denied a choice, every child born into a cage of gold and madness. It is the story of an empire that believed its blood was sacred and paid the ultimate price. And the monster? The monster was never just Charles, or Carlos, or even the Habsburg jaw. The monster was the system itself. History remembers crowns and battles, conquests and treaties, but sometimes it is in the quiet horror of a broken child dressed in velvet, seated on a throne, that we find the deepest truth. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow genetic suicide. And as we marvel at their palaces and portraits, we must not forget the cost written behind those royal eyes. So, what do you think? Was Charles II a victim, a symbol, or both? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories from the shadows of history.